Marla.
Hi, Marla.
Hey.
Welcome. Thank you for that call, Skip. Thank all of you for coming. It is my true honor and pleasure today to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Michael Ralph at the Hutchins Center Du Bois Fellows Colloquium. Me and Michael go way back to my graduate school days when I was working on my dissertation and serving as the managing editor for Manny Marable's journal Souls, a journal of Black politics, culture, and society. And Michael was an assistant professor at NYU and on the editorial advisory board. We were the two youngest people in the room whenever we would have our board meetings, and we quickly became friends and co-conspirators. And I will never forget the way Michael stepped up to help me shepherd the journal after Manning passed away in the spring 2011, even though Michael was the only junior faculty member on the board. During that period of crisis, I came not only to regard Mike as a good friend, but I also witnessed a true level of strength, courage, and fortitude that we don't always find in these spaces. So thank you, Mike. So flash forward 7+ years, and Michael has published a book and is now associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the School of Medicine at NYU. Michael earned his BA in Africana Studies from Morris Brown College and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, where our own Jean and John Komaroff served as his advisors. His wide-ranging scholarship spans continents and histories, integrating political science, economics, history, and medical anthropology through a focus on debt, slavery, insurance, forensics, and incarceration. He's at the forefront of the emerging work on racial capitalism. Michael's 2015 University of Chicago Press book, Forensics of Capital, explores how Senegalese people determine who owes what to whom in daily interactions and in geopolitics. In showing how discourses on debt are used to assess social standing, Michael traces how Senegal became a leader of political and economic reform in Africa. Here, Michael treats forensics as a theory of capital as well as a theory of sovereignty, arguing that the social profile of an individual or country is a credit profile as well as a forensic profile. Shifting from forensics of capital, Michael's recent projects center on slavery, insurance, and incarceration. In his book, Life, Michael explores how the U.S. insurance industry affixes monetary value to human life. And he does this with more breadth and nuance than any scholar has yet attempted. Yeah, I will say it. Breaking with the consensus among historians that slave insurance is distinct from life insurance because slaves were legally classified as property, Michael demonstrates that life insurance was built from the legal rationale and commercial logic of slave insurance. Although previous studies of slavery and insurance have largely focused on slaves as cargo, Michael reveals why large-scale owners preferred to rent rather than to sell slaves after the abolition of the trade in 1808. And no one has ever really examined the private firms and entrepreneurs who rented slaves in the decades leading up or before emancipation, or illuminated the thriving market in slave insurance during this period. And you can check it all out on the multimedia archive that Michael built called the Treasury of Weary Souls, which is the most comprehensive ledger of the enslaved Africans who built American industry and includes data on the financial firms who continue to profit from slave insurance policies today. So treasuryofwearysouls.com, check it out. Today, Michael will draw from material from his new book, Before 13th, which explores how free people can be trapped in a predicament that approximates slavery and revises the scholarly consensus on the history of convict leasing by demonstrating that it did not begin with the 13th Amendment, but several decades prior. And when this hits the field of carceral studies, stuff is really going to blow up, so I'm very excited for this. In addition to these groundbreaking research projects and his ongoing ethnographic work in Eritrea, Michael is an accomplished photographer and wrote and directed a project near and dear to my heart, which is the forthcoming animated short musical called Fishing, which explores the ingenuity of people who are incarcerated. This on top of the fact that he is editor-in-chief of Transforming Anthropology, the flagship journal of the Association of Black Anthropologists. So I told you Michael Ralph is wide-ranging, and maybe the most apt description would be a cosmopolitan Renaissance man. I'm still not done. Michael's contributions have been rightfully noticed. He has received numerous awards and recognition in addition to his Du Bois Fellowship here, including prestigious fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Social Sciences Research Council, the National National Science Foundation, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and Harvard's Charles Warren Center. I'm sure with this new work, there's many, many more to come. We are so very lucky to have Michael with us. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome. Great. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. I know. I feel like we should clap for the introduction. Give it up for Elizabeth Hinton, please. Thank you. I appreciate you being so generous. It's truly a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Krishna, Velma, Sean, Sandra, Abby, Amy, and everyone else who's made me feel really welcome here. I definitely want to thank Skip most of all for being such a brilliant mind and such a great mentor. And, without a doubt, one of the foremost institution builders in the history of Black America, safe to say. Like all of my research, what I'm going to discuss today began while I was working on something else. So, as Elizabeth mentioned, in 2014-15, I was a fellow at the Charles Warren Center, and I started working on this multimedia project, Treasury of Weary Souls, under the direction of Vince Brown and Glenna Carpio, who sort of ran the institute under the theme Multimedia, Literature, and History. And the project was to build a comprehensive ledger of insured slaves, and it's organized partly by industry. As you can see here, an enslaved person named Harry who worked in Alabama, the owner H.M. Wheat, his occupation blacksmith. But you can also look at it by insurer, and on the left side at the bottom you can see AIG, Aetna, the Baltimore Life Insurance Company, which is defunct, and New York Life Insurance Company. 3 of the 4 companies are still in existence, and you can just see different companies that profited from slave insurance policies. Sometimes it means that the company purchased policies at an earlier moment. Other times they inherited other companies that once had these policies. The site was actually built by a Boston area tech firm that helps at-risk young people and some who are formerly incarcerated find jobs in the tech sector. It's called Resilient Coders. And it was while working on this site that I sort of discovered something that became the basis for this research on convict leasing. When I built an Excel spreadsheet to give to the coders to build the site, I noticed that the occupations of enslaved people from Kentucky often were not listed. So that made me wonder what enslaved people were doing in Kentucky, and that led me to the archives. And while I was in the archives, I found a memo written from the warden of the Kentucky Penitentiary to the governor saying that he didn't want to continue farming hemp, although it had been the most profitable source of revenue for the past 3 decades. I thought that was interesting because I didn't know that hemp was produced in the prison. That made me wonder more about when hemp was farmed in the prison and how that connection came about. And that sort of led me to research I'll be discussing today. And what follows, I argued that Kentucky was the first site of convict leasing in the U.S. because of its unique relationship to 3 related developments: the plight of debtors in the aftermath of the American Revolution, which means it was the birth of the nation and not the events following the U.S. Civil War that set convict leasing in motion. I link these developments to the formation of the domestic slave trade and the increased significance of incarceration as a part of 19th century liberal progressive reform. And so there's been a little bit done on the Kentucky Penitentiary, a little bit done on convict leasing, but today I want to talk about a sort of unique intersection of race, skill, geography, and ability that explains how convict leasing started, when it did, where it did, and how it did. After 1776, recovering from a brutal and expensive war with Britain was one of the nation's top priorities. The war freed Americans from British laws restricting movement, and so many people headed west that Virginia merchants who could not recover their debts would sometimes just mark in their account books, "Gone to Kentucky." The U.S. Senator from Kentucky, Colonel Richard M. Johnson's impassioned 1823 speech on a proposition to abolish imprisonment for debt conveys the position of most elected officials. Johnson understood that people should pay their debts, but he was resolute that creditors did not have the power to deprive the debtor of his freedom, contrasting contractual debt with legalized slavery. Because of this pervasive sentiment, in Kentucky and wherever else they migrated, the historian Bruce Mann notes, debtors did not live as outlaws. Debtors settled towns, opened stores, carved farms out of the wilderness, built plantations, bought slaves, traded, voted, socialized, worshipped, married, reared children, etc. In the clear language of the foremost expert on this issue, debtors lived outside the practical reach of all but the most determined creditors, which created a problem for the kind of society the framers of the U.S. Constitution had envisioned, one in which they could carve out unprecedented profits through new opportunities to access commercial credit. Pushing back against legislation favoring the plight of debtors, the framers of the U.S. Constitution structured it to levy taxes and tighten the monetary supply to enhance the financial position of creditors. The framers considered Article 1, Section 10 to be the most important provision. It barred the states from printing money, prevented people from using anything except gold and silver to pay debts, and strengthened penalties for breaking contracts. The framers were not merely trying to protect their own investments, not all of them were even wealthy, but they were determined to make the U.S. safe for capital investment. For these reasons, Kentucky was a battlefield between debtors and creditors from the moment it was settled in the last few decades of the 18th century. Some people felt banks were not doing enough to provide relief. Others felt the banks were too lenient and worried that inflation would surge. Enter Henry Clay, the renowned Kentucky senator and orator. At an October 18, 1820 meeting for the Bank of Kentucky, Clay gave an impassioned 3-hour speech calling for a new bank charter that would contest the evil of relief policies. Gifted in using empathy for the oppressed to inscribe circumstances of privilege, Clay proposed a policy of moderate but gradually increasing calls on debtors. But debtors still had momentum on their side. Kentucky became the first U.S. state to abolish imprisonment for debt, and Colonel Richard M. Johnson followed his 1823 speech with an 1824 address to the U.S. Senate on the subject of abolishing imprisonment for debt, as states from Ohio and Maryland to Massachusetts and New York followed Kentucky's lead. But the same dynamics instituted to make Kentucky a haven for debtors ultimately made it miserable for enslaved and incarcerated people, giving rise to new forms of coercive labor. Kentucky began as a diaspora of Virginia, whose legal architecture was the basis for their first criminal statutes. More specifically, it was based on legal statutes native son Thomas Jefferson had drafted, but was unable to get adopted. After spending some time in France where penitentiaries were replacing capital punishment for most serious crimes, Jefferson's example persuaded Kentucky's first settlers that time on task could reform the wayward soul. So in 1796, they decided, and in 1798, they began building a penitentiary. True to the unprecedented nature of their project, the penitentiary was built even before there was anyone to incarcerate. Later that year, John Turner was convicted of stealing someone's horse, a crime that would have been punishable by death 6 months prior. This being his first offense, Turner was sentenced to the penitentiary for 2 years, becoming Kentucky's first convict. The penitentiary was run by a keeper who managed the facility, an agent who kept the books, and a council of inspectors appointed by the governor. The penitentiary settled on physical toil as the chief virtue and key to personal transformation. Usually incarcerated people did what they had been doing on the outside as their punishment. The penitentiary employed inmates in a range of artisanal craft professions, including blacksmiths, cobblers, nail makers, and spinners. But elected officials and members of the Prison Review Committee quickly began to complain that the division of labor was ill-conceived and haphazard. The penitentiary struggled to break even, much less turn a profit. That is, until the watershed regime of Joel Scott, the wealthy textile manufacturer who assumed the duties of keeper in 1825. Scott convinced the state legislature to lease the prison to him to run as a private business in exchange for $6,000 plus 6.5% of annual profit. He then embarked on a dramatic plan to overhaul the institution. He began by ordering uniforms for all of the inmates. Then, claiming the prison yard was encumbered with what he called filth of all kinds, he established new standards for cleanliness. Scott made extensive renovations down to the sketches of machinery he wanted the prison to include. He transformed prison labor, making it less like a series of artisanal workshops and more like a factory specializing in a few commodities. Scott's ambitious plan to transform the appearance and labor structure of the prison articulated with a new vision for liberal reform. Consider the report Governor Joseph Dacia issued to the Kentucky legislature a mere 2 years after Scott's tenure began. Much labor-saving machinery has been constructed and new branches of manufacturing introduced, which promises to be highly advantageous and gives this institution the appearance of a busy and extensive manufacturing establishment rather than a place of punishment. The convicts themselves, though constantly at labor at all proper hours, seem as contented as men could be in such a situation. Dacia would have us believe that reform was still the state's chief priority. Much pains have also been taken to inculcate upon them moral and religious principles, but I regret to say that these efforts have been attended with but little success. The frequent and speedy return of convicts under sentence for new crimes committed almost in the first moment of their release admonish us that we must not be too sanguine in looking to our own penitentiary as a means of reformation. Anticipating critics of his emphasis on prison industry, Governor Dacia stressed the social benefits of longer sentences under Scott's new work regime. Instances are known in which convicts have formed associations with the penitentiary to plunder and rob as soon as they get out. And without further legislation, they may constitute a kind of banditry which will be dangerous to society. Would it not be better for the state and safer for people in cases whose repeated convictions for high crimes have proved the utter hopelessness of reformation, so to change the law as to confine these incorrigible offenders for very long terms or life? Governor Dacia would ultimately argue that longer prison sentences even benefited former inmates in the long run. They might then be made to support themselves instead of living upon the plunder of honest citizens and by their earnings render to society some slight compensation for the evils they may have afflicted. Meanwhile, Joel Scott built an organizational culture that was consistent with the latest in prison science, combining Eastern Penitentiary in Pennsylvania's famous techniques for keeping inmates separate with Auburn Prison in New York's focus on silence. After the completion of the new cells, the keeper, for all the time after, was to keep the convicts in separate cells at night and to prevent all conversation between them during the day. And the system of silent by day and separate at night was put fully into operation. Members of a Kentucky legislature that had historically expressed little interest in the penitentiary now raved about the new day Scott had made. In their words, penitentiary cells had formerly been, without a solitary exception, veritable schools of vice, mere dens of iniquity, in which all the ingenuity of depraved and wicked men had been successfully exerted to receive and impart lessons of immorality and concert dark schemes of the most abominable and atrocious villainy. Now, in their view, a brighter and better day seems to dawn upon those abodes of darkness and hitherto nurseries of crime. The defects of the system were believed to be detected and exposed, and remedies applied which were being put in full and successful operation. Hemp was the key to Scott's new attitude, as he explains during an annual report in 1829. I have made extensive and valuable improvements in the establishment. I have built a shed 84 yards long for the manufacture of bagging, which was used to sheath cotton in the plantation south, and have an operation of 4 bagging looms, and have also erected a hemp house within the walls. The improvements have enabled me to introduce into the institution the following rules and regulations, which I feel bound to submit to the legislature as a part of my report, as the economy of the establishment and its prison discipline are subjects of the most interesting concern to the legislature and to the community. In other words, Scott had decided his dual mandate concerned the economy of the establishment and prison discipline, even if he failed to clarify how his plan might achieve the lofty goal of reform that was the penitentiary's stated goal initially. But even if Scott's vision for moral reform remained hazy, his revenue streams were crystal clear. By the 1840s, hemp would be the Kentucky Penitentiary's chief source of revenue, the outcome of Scott's deliberate decision to have white and black inmates, men and women, farm a crop that enslaved African men had historically worked almost exclusively. Within years of moving to Kentucky, residents began to farm and cultivate hemp near their forts and cabins. The plant was attractive because, in the view of one bluegrass expert, hemp exhausts the soil slowly, if at all. The main reason hemp was so popular in Kentucky is that it could be used to make a wide range of household goods. In the absence of cotton plantations, hemp could be used to make clothing. Hemp was used to make baskets, as well as rope, which had a number of important functions. Due to hemp's durability, it was even used to make sails that were exported to the U.S. Navy. So while hemp was not a major crop for the American colonies, it was pivotal to the Kentucky economy. Kentucky's landscape favored producing several crops simultaneously. Kentucky farmers reserved land for hemp, flax, and tobacco, shifting their attention to each crop based on changes in season and weather patterns. Thus, economic growth involved a calculus concerning land fertility and industrial organization, in tandem with the infrastructure of enslavement. Henry Clay is famous for coaching President Abraham Lincoln in a pragmatic approach to enslavement that condemned its evils while preserving the infrastructure of coercion, labor, and revenue that made it profitable. Clay is the architect of the American system, a materialist theory of nature invested in gleaning from the land what can be wrested into profit. He criticized foreign trade and argued that the U.S. would instead triumph economically by focusing on domestic industries like Kentucky hemp. But it is crucial to note that the American system is not merely a theory of trade, but a commitment to economic organization that shaped Clay's material existence. Soon after he arrived in Kentucky from Virginia, Clay acquired partial ownership of a hemp factory. As such, his sources of revenue would include products made from hemp, like boat sails and rope. In discussing slavery, Clay preferred the dispassionate language of an orator and elected official. But in a published critique, Frederick Douglass reminded Clay that his position had broader ramifications. Frederick Douglass made the North Star, the newspaper he had founded, the occasion for his 1847 letter to Henry Clay, addressing the famed orator and elected official who had given a speech the month prior concerning his position on what he called the great evil of slavery. Douglass begins by approaching Clay as one of the unhappy millions enduring the evils of slavery in this otherwise highly favored and glorious land. Douglass pays special attention to Clay's claim that his opinions on the subject of slavery are well known, that they have the merit, if it be one, of consistency, uniformity, and long duration. The first sentence, Douglass replies, is probably true. Your opinions on slavery may be well known, but that they have the merit of consistency or of uniformity, I cannot readily admit. Douglass clarifies, if the speech before me be a fair declaration of your present opinions, I think I can convince you that even this speech abounds with inconsistencies such as to materially affect the consolation you seem to draw from this source. Indeed, muses Douglass, if you are uniform at all, you are only so in your inconsistencies. Douglass puzzles over Clay's statement that slavery is a great evil and a wrong to its victims, as with Clay's claim that he would rejoice if not a single slave breathed the air within the limits of our country. These are noble sentiments and would seem to flow from a heart overborne with a sense of the flagrant injustice and enormous cruelty of slavery, and of one earnestly and anxiously longing for a remedy. Standing alone, it would imply that the author had long been in search of some means to redress the wrongs of the unfortunate victims of whom he speaks, that his righteous soul was every hour deeply grieved on account of the foul blot inflicted by this course on his country's character. But, Douglass asks, what are the facts? You are yourself at this moment a slaveholder. Is this consistency and uniformity? If so, the oppressed may well pray to the Most High that you may soon be delivered from it. Douglass dismisses Clay's argument that a resolution to slavery must foster the security and happiness of both races as either a form of low cunning or a pathetic attempt at vanity that should not even be entertained. Douglass rejects Clay's position that every state has the supreme, uncontrolled, and exclusive power to resolve the slavery question for itself as the most profligate and infernal, monstrous and blood-chilling doctrine. What confidence, Douglass asked Clay, can any enlightened lover of liberty place in your pretended opposition to slavery? Clay's notion that in plantation states where the slaves outnumber the whites, the blacks could not be emancipated without becoming the governing power in these states strikes Douglass as a flat contradiction of the democratic principles the Kentucky politician espouses. And yet the frightful scenario Clay conjures is worth contrasting with his adopted state of Kentucky, where slaves do not outnumber the whites. To condense the argument I develop in the forthcoming manuscript, historians have overstated the extent to which Lincoln's stance, which derives from Henry Clay's stance, was a clever rhetorical formulation rather than a pragmatic stance deriving from material interests. Clay and his compatriots had investments in hemp farms and thus in slavery. Slavery was widely practiced in Kentucky, but the absence of plantation agriculture meant that households usually only had a few. People enslaved in Kentucky were expected to tend livestock, but primarily to work on hemp. Dan Bogie, enslaved on Madison County's Wheeler Plantation, and Aunt Harriet Mason, enslaved on the Jones Plantation in Girard County, recall wearing clothes of tow linen, another term for hemp. Burt Mayfield, enslaved on the Stone Plantation south of Bryantsville, discusses how intimately they were bound in hemp in his discussion of an annual ritual. On Christmas, each of us stood in line to get our clothes. We were measured with a string, which was made by a cobbler. The material had been woven by slaves in a plantation shop. The flax and hemp were raised on the plantation. Excuse me. As such, enslaved workers skilled in farming hemp were highly coveted. In 1827, Kentucky Reporter advertisement boasting about Negroes for sale took care to mention a Negro man who was a first-rate hemp hackler. And as Burt Mayfield notes, Negro virtuosity, including hackling, extracting, and weaving fibers from hemp, explains why slaves with these skills were insured alongside artisans like blacksmiths and cobblers. Hemp farming had become so intricate in 19th century Kentucky that enslaved farmers were sometimes roped together in precise intervals to make sure they distributed the hemp evenly. After 120 days, hemp was cultivated using one of two methods. In a process called dew rotting, the hemp was cut and spread on the ground for several months so that rain, snow, and dew could bleed the plant of its cherished resin and help bind the fiber to the woody part of the stalk. Water rotting involved fixing the hemp plant in a still body of water, usually a large pond. After several months, the plant was strained and spread on the ground to dry, then subjected to a handbrake. Water rotting produced a hemp plant of greater softness and durability, but Kentucky farmers favored dew rotting, the least expensive and most straightforward method. Once rotted, the hemp plant was dried and stacked. Next, the lint would be separated from the wood through a process that involved breaking the stalks. Then farmers would hackle the hemp to extract the fibers. The most successful implement for these tasks involved what was called a handbrake, an instrument with three sharp grid-like slats layered on top of each other. The height of a handbrake was typically 2 inches in front and 6 inches in the back, so that the implement could shave fibers from the hemp plant and spit them out the other side. During the decades that hemp was a profitable crop, there were numerous attempts to mechanize the process. Yet by the time the age of hemp was drawing to a close, the industry had reached a consensus about the demographic that had mastered the crop, best expressed in an 1859 Kentucky Farmer article. Quite a variety of machinery has been tried for hemp breaking, together with Dutch, Irish, and natives, but a stout Negro man with a good handbrake, a fair task before him, and prompt pay for his overwork now has a decided preference, if not a complete monopoly. Breaking and cleaning by horsepower machinery is a possible achievement, but would hardly be profitable. The origins of this preference lie in the challenge of pulling fibers from the hemp plant. In 1836, a resident of Lexington, Kentucky, explained the pervasive role of bonded labor by insisting that hemp farming was so laborious that scarcely any white man will work at it. Hemp was recalcitrant, the process of extracting fibers deemed a Herculean task conducted in marshy conditions. Hemp farming was, as one observer put it, a very dirty process. Laborious and unpleasant, hemp farming was reserved for slave labor. As William C. Bullitt of the 1859-1860 Kentucky Constitutional Convention insisted, the free states do not and will not raise hemp. Kentucky and Missouri, whose industry ranked second, have the monopoly of this great article. This, as long as slavery remains, must be the case. According to the foremost authority on the subject, without hemp, slavery might not have flourished in Kentucky, since other agricultural products of the state were not conducive to the extensive use of bondsmen. In other words, as another observer put it, the closest Kentucky ever got to a southern plantation was the large bluegrass farm upon which hemp was one of the major crops and where virtually all manual labor was performed by slaves. But since hemp does not require as much attention as must be given to cotton, the number of Negroes on a Kentucky farm was usually far less than the number necessary on a cotton plantation of comparable size. Burt Mayfield, again of the Stone Plantation, carefully explains the diverse age groups involved in the elaborate task of producing clothes from hemp. The younger slaves had to swingle it with a wooden instrument, somewhat like a sword, about 2 feet long, and called a swingler. The hemp was hackled by the older slaves. The hackle was an instrument made of iron teeth about 4 inches long, 1/2 inch apart, and set in a wooden plank 1 1/2 feet long, which was set on a heavy bench. The hemp stalks were laid on these benches, and hackled herds were then pulled through and heaped in piles and taken to the workshop, where it was twisted and then woven according to our needs. Ropes, carpets, and clothing were made from this fiber. This recollection underscores the fact that, as one observer put it, enslaved men had held a monopoly on all tasks connected with hemp farming. Observers belittled enslaved women. An 1836 Farmers Register article suggesting that Negro women cannot labor at hemp at all. But this was all part of the way that expertise in hemp farming had acquired a distinct gendered and racial quality, evident in the open letter H. Blanton wrote to the American farmer 3 years later, in which he gushed, "None but our strong Negro men can handle hemp to advantage." With like praise, another Kentucky farmer declared, "As long as hemp was produced in the state, at least certain types of work, such as breaking the stalks, were largely reserved for the Negro." After years of repetition of these tasks, he did become an expert at their performance. Over time, Kentucky farmers came to believe that this extraordinary expertise derived from a special affinity for the crop. As a 1926 New York Times article remarked, Kentuckians sometimes referred to hemp as a nigger crop, owing to a belief that no one understood its eccentricities as well or was as expert in handling it as the Negro. In other words, hemp and slavery went hand in hand, exerting a disproportionate influence on the geography of labor in 19th century Kentucky. On the hemp farm and in the hemp factories, the need for laborers was filled to a large extent by the use of Negro slaves, and it is a significant fact that the heaviest concentration of slavery was in the hemp-producing area. The idea that Negroes possessed unique expertise with hemp was a compliment masquerading as an insult. Kentucky farmers marveled at Negro ingenuity, at the fact that enslaved workers outperformed horses or any sort of technology they had managed to develop. They were also enchanted by the skill enslaved workers acquired in weaving rope, clothes, and sails from such a stubborn plant. But this commentary also revealed that hemp had never been the basis for a major capital investment, nor had so much infrastructure been devoted to it until Joel Scott took over the Kentucky Penitentiary. Toil was the key to reform from the earliest days of the Kentucky Penitentiary, but some inmates did not have any discernible skills. One early inspector, known simply as Mr. Blair, glossed this predicament as an evil of considerable magnitude, an evil that would fester unless some plain and useful line of labor can be considered as the order of the day for newcomers. Decades before Joel Scott pioneered convict leasing using hemp, Blair had pondered the idea. "I have thought that the spinning of hemp, ropes, and twine, and eventually thread fine enough for coarse linen, might be so learnt that the preparation of hemp would afford some employment, and that the procuring of implements and materials will be attended with but an inconsiderable expense." Yet Blair received disappointing news in preliminary discussions with regional experts. The conductor of the rope manufactory near this town is, however, of opinion that the spinning of hemp is an employment which cannot be beneficially taken up by persons arrived at years of maturity. Blair seemed to realize that extracting fibers from such a stubborn plant favors workers who have spent their entire lives perfecting the task, enslaved workers. Blair's research led him to one of Kentucky's chief sites of slave trafficking, but he never managed to connect with the people needed to put his plan in place. I had hoped to have been able to obtain further information on this subject at Lexington, especially if I could have met with some person there. This, however, has not been in my power. It would take Joel Scott to make the stubborn hemp plant the basis for a new system of coercive labor, and extended prison sentences made working with hemp a lot more like slavery than the short sentences that were handed out in the early days of the Kentucky Penitentiary. Joel Scott was keeper of the penitentiary from 1825 until 1834, when ill health forced him to resign. From a time when keepers were made very little money for themselves or for the state, Scott raked in more than $1 million in today's terms. Scott made being keeper a coveted position. His successor, Thomas S. Theobald, made more than $6 million in today's terms. From running the penitentiary as a business, the Kentucky penitentiary system would eventually hire inmate labor to contractors, outside contractors, and deploy them on public works projects, including railroads and roads that paved the way for westward expansion. The Kentucky Penitentiary was shut down and later converted to a juvenile facility. Another prison was built that lacked even the semblance of reform, and a psychiatric facility was eventually established that, together with the two carceral institutions, was combined under the governance of a bureau dedicated to public welfare. The striking connection between incarceration and welfare highlights a key theme of Elizabeth Hinton's work. If the war on poverty eventually became a war on crime, we might also look to the way that forms of incarceration produced patterns of poverty that later paved the way for wars against crime. Kentucky's convict leasing complex eventually led the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal to declare that Kentucky was the only state where convicts were sold into absolute slavery. Legislators worried that Kentucky was the only state free from direct responsibility toward its convicted criminals, and especially damning criticism from a state that had initially conceived of itself as a beacon of enlightened criminal jurisprudence. Convict leasing emerged from a context that had enabled slavery to thrive for nearly 90 years following the American Revolution. By the time the U.S. shook its status as a British colony to become a sovereign nation, 500,000 human beings were held in bondage. During the next few decades, slavery would grow in tandem with the United States, spreading west to Kentucky and Missouri, and south to Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. In the process, the number of people held in bondage would triple. The infrastructure of enslavement is the most reliable proxy for the infrastructure of convict leasing that followed. Scholars generally associate the origin of convict leasing with the 13th Amendment, but Kentucky was actually one of the last states to ratify. Just as Kentucky did not rely on the 13th Amendment for finding ways to enslave citizens, the 13th Amendment is not the origin of convict leasing in the U.S. Instead, convict leasing was born from experiments in capitalism and liberal reform set in motion by the War for Independence. It took a textile manufacturer from a slaveholding family to show the nation how much profit could be generated by making coercive labor available to men and women, black and white people, from different sectors of a new, free society. In recent years, scholars have pointed to declining mortality rates for white people living in the Rust Belt region where Joel Scott pioneered convict leasing on U.S. soil. This suggests that there is some empirical basis for the rage of poorly educated, impoverished whites who claim a long history of exploitation and dehumanization. It also means they share the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. But their claim provokes the need for more careful accounting about who got rich from the ingenuity of enslaved Africans who used hemp to fuel the Kentucky economy and got nothing in return except for more opportunities for diversity with their brothers and sisters in bondage. Thank you. Okay, questions?
Excuse me. Thank you. Elizabeth, would you like to ask the first question? We have to pass, you have to help me. We have to pass the mic because, you know, each one of these is being streamed.
Thank you so much for that talk, Michael. I learned so much from what you had to say, and I actually kind of want to pick up where you ended and push you a little bit on that because I am teaching mass incarceration and historical perspective, and so I have, you know, the narrative that I give my students and that exists in literature right now is exactly what you said, that convict leasing is born out of the 13th Amendment, that the number of people of African descent who were in prisons and jails before emancipation was very low in the southern states, not in the north. There's always been disproportionate numbers of free black people in prison. So I guess, you know, one, I have so many questions buzzing in my mind. How much is Kentucky a really kind of unique and distinct example of this kind of earlier form of convict leasing? Is part of what you're discovering the result of the kind of gap in the literature on convict leasing, which really focuses more on states like Mississippi and Alabama? So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, you know, if convict leasing is born out of the revolutionary period, what are the implications for kind of the process of how we understand the process of criminalization? How do you think I should then, because we're in 2 weeks, we're headed there, how should I kind of reframe the way that I discuss the 13th Amendment within my class, how I teach convict leasing? I guess, like, what are the real kind of implications, and what might some of the implications be in terms of understanding prison labor and these struggles today? I have many more questions.
No, it's a great question. I think so. another way to put your question is to say, like, okay, so what is the status, like, of this claim versus, as you say, the literature, and how do we think of the 13th Amendment? So I would say, what's interesting is that in many ways, scholars concerned with the 13th Amendment, or sort of the widespread sense of the 13th Amendment and what is at stake, is accurate, right? It's accurate that the 13th Amendment is kind of a catalyst for convict leasing. It's accurate that it's presented a strategy for translating free labor into the carceral sites, and sort of eliminated from public view, right? And I guess you could even say, like, I make a similar argument about life insurance that, people had thought of slaves as property, but people who insured them recognized them for their skills. And what at the end of slavery meant was that, I guess, all people could get life insurance, even African Americans. But the life insurance industry essentially establishes a monetary value in human lives based on confidential information. So it's like family medical history, risk factors, projected future earnings, things that aren't available to the public. So in a way, you could argue that it sort of privatizes the hierarchy and monetary value of human lives that was public in the context of slavery, right? And that it's sort of a way of privatizing this hierarchy that fits with what we understand to be a free society. So in the same way that incarceration is hidden from plain view, the actuarial calculus that's used to rank human beings is hidden from plain sight, I guess, and that's sort of maybe what capitalism means. But in terms of the literature specifically, I think it's a catalyst, an important catalyst, and it's true that after the 13th Amendment, you'd see prisons all throughout the South that are like 90% African American, and like African Americans being picked up on like dubious charges, vagrancy, loitering, just to incarcerate them, just to essentially make them into slaves. But I guess my point is, first of all, that the prison where this began, the penitentiary in Kentucky, was integrated, so there were white inmates, there were black inmates, there were men and women, and so that's interesting as a point of departure. And I think what people who focus on the 13th Amendment are saying is that for African Americans in particular, the 13th Amendment was especially horrific because it was a way of preserving slavery, right? So this newly emancipated group is essentially returned to slavery through the 13th Amendment. That's true. But that doesn't mean that the 13th Amendment was the novel strategy for doing that. If anything, I would say that the reason why the language reads that way in the 13th Amendment is because some people realize that the only existing example of legalized slavery was essentially the penitentiary, right, the Kentucky model. So they're like, well, slavery's ending, but we can still hold on to it because actually in Kentucky, they've enslaved citizens in prisons, you know what I mean? So I think it's actually evident of an insight or a kind of practical strategy that people understood to be available to them rather than a new idea that was enshrined in the Constitution. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, thank you. That was extremely helpful. Can I just ask a follow-up factual
sure.
question?
No. Yes, go ahead.
So, not many people actually have studied the presence of people of African descent in prisons and jails in the period before emancipation.
Right.
And so I'm wondering
And
how,
you're right, too, when you said that there weren't that many per se.
Right, yeah, so that's what I wanted to know. Like,
Yeah.
how
Weren't that many what? People of
sorry,
color
African
in
Black
Americans.
people,
Like,
yeah,
it's true, like, say,
prisoners.
for instance, in the Kentucky Penitentiary, it's hard to figure out just how
Yeah.
many African Americans there were, but there were more white people than African Americans in the Kentucky Penitentiary.
But
as
do we,
well.
so the black people who did end up in prison there, the men and women, what are they getting arrested for? And do you know anything about kind of that process too? Because it's so, from what I understand, and what is kind of the conventional historiographical thinking is that there were very few people. But this seems, and then again, was it that people were kind of looking to arrest or somehow incarcerate black people because of the strong association between their expertise in the production of hemp?
Yeah, no, I
Wait a
think...
minute, slow down. I just want to make sure everyone's following.
Yeah,
You're talking about the free Negro community
Yeah.
before the end of the Civil War, right?
Yeah. The question is about, like, well, what were the numbers of African Americans in the Kentucky Penitentiary, and also, was there a strategy for arresting African Americans because of this interest in building the sort of penitentiary hemp factory, basically? I think that the penitentiary hemp factory was actually understood as a kind of parallel industry, right? I think Joe Scott's strategy was that, actually, since you essentially need slavery to have a hemp industry, if I can build a hemp industry in the prison, I can have slavery in the prison. And it wasn't about trying to bring African Americans in because of their expertise. It was more about this assumption that white inmates can be essentially enslaved as well. I mean, that wasn't the language, but that was the discourse that emerged, right? But I still think, actually, though, there was, what I have not seen, though, is a discourse about white inmates that was the same as a discourse about sort of Negro ingenuity attached to hemp and slavery more broadly, you know? So maybe it's because, I guess, free white people, I don't know, like, how present that idea of what was happening in the penitentiary was from them in that moment. You know, like, how aware were they of the shift in the penitentiary labor system from a kind of artisanal space to, like, a factory, right? Because, so I don't know, it's an interesting empirical question, but I've not seen, like, you know, there's a very interesting discourse of Negro eccentricity and the eccentricity of hemp. Like I say, it's a kind of compliment masquerading as an insult, you know, or insult masquerading as a compliment, you know, like, there's something special about the skills they've acquired, or there's something special about them that makes them perfect for this job or something like that, you know. But yeah, I mean, there weren't necessarily large numbers. We can discuss the details like another time. But so I don't think this literature necessarily displaces the broader sense that African Americans were by and large enslaved more than they were incarcerated prior to emancipation. But I do think it destabilizes the idea that somehow really aggressive strategies of exploitation were reserved exclusively for African Americans. You know what I mean? Like, I think that, like, sometimes people think convict leasing is so diabolical that only African Americans would have been subjected to it. You know, and I think that's a kind of discourse attached to the 13th Amendment that this research sort of dislodges.
And do you have a sense? Last question. It can be yes or no. Is this pre-13th Amendment form of convict leasing? Is this unique to Kentucky, or is it happening?
Also, good question. Well,
yeah.
So one thing I do want to say explicitly, and I'll say this in the published work, but the reason why I think people miss this, by and large, like, there's been a little bit written about the Kentucky Penitentiary, even a little bit written about convict leasing, so it's not that people haven't noticed that it happened, it's just that most people, with the exception of maybe like one author, I think, don't really understand it to have been the origin, right? Like, I think people, even you could read books on history of incarceration and their periodization is off. They'll say, like, the first sites of convict leasing were Texas, Louisiana, this, and they'll have Kentucky in there somewhere, but it's like in the wrong order, you know? And I think because, I actually think it's part of a broader narrative that the North was more enlightened and sort of enlightened and liberal, and the South was horrific and unjust, and places like Kentucky and Maryland were somewhere in the middle. There's kind of an assumption that, yes, they had slavery, but it wasn't as bad, and it must be somewhere in the middle. And part of my argument is actually that, yes, Kentucky was not the same as, like, Southern frontier justice, but it's precisely that kind of experiment with capitalism and this idea of liberal reform that created the conditions for this strategy. That, in other words, like, capitalist exploitation doesn't just thrive on sort of violence and vengeance and things we associate with the South. It also thrives on, like, scientific techniques. You know, it was like Joel Scott was, like, designing machines and, like, redesigning the prison and getting uniforms. Like, he was, like, tailorizing before Taylor, basically, stuff like that, you know? So I think that's important, actually, for all, because life insurance, too, right, is, like, progress from slave insurance, or, like, more enlightened, less inhumane or something, but incredibly devastating and exploitative, right? Like, what does it mean for your life not to have much value despite all these years you've worked, and someone else's life has tremendous value? And they're counting factors like family medical history, which you can't control, or actuaries increasingly are using, like, zip code as a proxy for risk factor. So you could be, like, a straight A student in an impoverished area, crime-infested area, and maybe your policy is valued less than a kind of slacker from a wealthy area, you know, because maybe according to their statistical calculations and their actuarial projections, you know, zip code is like a risk factor or something like that, you know. So.
Were there any European precedents for convict leasing? I have two questions following in the tradition of Professor Hinton. Were there any European, I mean, did Americans invent convict leasing? Whether debtor's prison was in England, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, and this is something I actually meant to clarify in my response to Elizabeth, but this is very helpful. I think, so one thing, part of the reason why I say specifically, I talk about this as the origin of convict leasing, is because there were other ways to exploit incarcerated people and even make money off of them. Like, there have been examples, like in Auburn prison, in New York, where someone who wanted a certain product made could bring them to the prison and essentially have the inmates make it, and the prison gets a cut of that, and the person essentially gets free labor, close to free labor. So it's not as if this was the origin of profiting from prison labor. It is the origin of this idea that you could essentially take the prison from the state, run it as a business, and cut them in. That's what I want to say. Like this particular kind of lease arrangement is what Joel Scott did, right? Yeah. So I think this is a very important distinction. This is
Privatization.
Yeah, privatization. And I think that that's why people overlooked it, because they thought, well, yeah, prisons have been making money off inmates for a while. And then they say, well, 13th Amendment, this changed, right? But it's actually Joel Scott pioneered this business model. But I also think there's something in the literature where a lot of the historians concerned with these issues are thinking of it more in terms of social history and the injustice of it, and less in terms of the particular financial arrangement. You know what I mean? Like, I think the idea that it was a lease in this particular percentage, and the idea of just getting a percentage, is a very particular kind of business arrangement, right? So it's not just that the prisoners were exploited and dehumanized, it's that he took it over. And actually, why that's important for the story is they really had no idea how much money he could make, you know? Like, they were actually surprised by how much money he made.
I bet he was too.
Right.
That's a lot of money, man.
Right. And then, like, his successor made 6 times as much as he did, and after that, they were like, we have to change the law. Like, we have to change the policy, because, like, we let you take over the prison because we didn't think prisons made money, you know? It's sort of like, I think, and this is why it's an important part of the history of progressive reform, because it's also like schools, right? Like, most people don't think of schools as making money for a long time. So it's almost to build a school, that's a great idea. But all of a sudden, if you have, like, okay, private companies publishing textbooks and private companies getting paid to do testing, then you see there's different ways to make money in school. You used to have conflicts of interest. But for a while, it wasn't readily apparent there would be conflicts of interest, because it's like running a school seems like a good thing, right? You know, so I think prisons seem like a good thing. It's better than capital punishment, right? Like, in the colonial era, in the U.S. and elsewhere, like, people were getting lynched for committing crimes, stealing. So a prison seemed like a like enlightened progressive reform compared to that. But then this is why it's an important story about sort of capitalist innovation as part of the story, right? That Joel Scott sees the opportunity.
Well, I'd be careful with the school analogy, because you have to remember there are schools like Eton in England and Winchester and Exeter and Andover. I mean, people knew you could make a lot of money from school.
That's a good point. Yeah, I guess I should just say that it's the kind of institution that could be framed as or seen as benign, and it wasn't always readily apparent how to make money from it, you know? Because, you know, for a long time in Kentucky, they were complaining about the penitentiary as being kind of a waste of time and a hassle, but that was about it, you know? It's like, oh, yeah, we lost money in the prison this year, made a little bit of money in the prison this year.
My second question, and then, of course, we'll open it up, is when and how did slavery, going back to the 13th Amendment, the majority of people had no idea about the 13th until the 13th. Right.
Yeah.
How did slavery and incarceration become equated? I mean, was this a linguistic, was there an etymological relationship? You know, it's not intuitive. You know, it's like.
Do you mean like in the public imagination? Why do we associate them so strongly?
No, in the Constitution, in the law.
Oh, in the Constitution. Oh, yeah.
When incarceration becomes, when all of a sudden slaves abolished, except one form. You go, what's that? You go,
yeah, I think it's
imprisonment. Where did that come from?
I think it's literally from the Kentucky example. I actually think that they thought, you know, slavery is about to be abolished, but there is a way that we can still get free labor, you know? Like, and I think part of why this is important is because it just shows how practical capitalism is. I think that people working in industries of trade and commerce can be ahead of the scholarship on trade and commerce or something like that. I don't know if I explain that, but what I mean is like the idea that like debt is profitable seems like outrageous and inhumane to people and to scholars, and seems obvious to people who've been like working in hedge funds or something like that. You know what I mean? And I think there's something important about that story for incarceration and slavery, like because the people who are building the prisons and the people who run the companies and own the land are all the same people and the same families. You know, so they're well aware of the repertoire of possibilities available to them, which is why it's dangerous to be hung up on sort of like the moral rationale for a shift in the legislation and the kind of sentiment around it, right? So like the end of slavery would seem like a great idea and a moment to rejoice if you think of it in terms of what slavery means and then what the law says. But if you think of it in terms of how money is made, you should be aware of the fact that people are going to find a way to make money. And I think there's something parallel with, let's say, the public discourse on cash bail, right? the public discourse on cash bail, and to the credit of the scholars and activists who worked tirelessly on this issue, people are now aware of the fact that essentially if you make below a certain amount of money in the Bronx, it's like $1,000, you're likely to stay in jail until your charges are dismissed or something like that. And if you can pay the cash bail, you're out right away. So people are being jailed because they're poor. So now the states that are proposing sort of legislation designed to counter that, more progressive legislation, are saying, okay, you don't have to go to jail. If you can't afford to pay your bail, you'll be on house arrest. But then house arrest means that you have an ankle monitor, and they charge you the cost of your own surveillance on the ankle monitor, which is sort of like paying like a really inflated phone bill. So now you go into debt for an ankle monitor, even if you're innocent and you're poor. And so they're making money off people, and then you can imagine, okay, whole neighborhoods where people are on house arrest. So it's like people are shut in their homes, they're paying going into debt, or being on house arrest, and yet cash bail is over, right? So you can rejoice. So I think that this idea of sort of making money from these different forms of exploitation or indebtedness, it's important to see it as a practical strategy, So like when Henry Clay gets up and gives a speech about how awful slavery is, there are people who will write about it like, as we know, Henry Clay was opposed to slavery. He didn't think it could be ended right away, but he believed it should be ended ultimately. And Henry Clay was like, yeah, I have these hemp farms, I'm not sure how long I'll have them, so let's just hold on to slavery and we'll revisit it, you know what I mean? But I think it's interesting that's presented as an enlightened position, and that's essentially Lincoln's position as well.
Professor West. I think she had it. Sister had her hand up before me. She is free to follow you. Is that right? Oh, that's so kind of you. No, I want to thank you for this fascinating presentation. 2 questions.
Sure.
What were the ways in which those within convict leasing preserved their dignity and resisted? And what forms of resistance from outside? Because even when we characterize it, it's still a balance of forces. It's always contingent. There's contestation and conflict that's taking place.
Yeah.
And just like 30 years ago when we talked about slavery, we really wanted to accent the ways in which the enslaved preserved humanity, dignity, community, ties, bonds, and sanity.
Yeah.
How was it for these folk, both inside and those who were concerned about them on the outside?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there was, part of the question is for the people who were incarcerated, I don't exactly know, right, because we don't have much in the way of written documents that they left, but you do see all kinds of strategies of undermining it. There were people who were injured or sort of allowed themselves to be injured to not be able to work according to the sort of work regime that's presented to them. There are people who escaped, and part of why Joel Scott renovated the penitentiary the way he did was because it was understood to be sort of too available to escape. There was obviously a lot of protest and sentiment against the penitentiary and against this shift in the kind of purpose of the penitentiary, because its stated goal was reform. Its stated goal was a kind of momentary opportunity for a person to kind of have some solitary time to reconnect with the sort of expectations of normative citizenship. So, I think this is a very important point. I mean, I was sort of like really focusing this paper on trying to highlight how this system came to be. But I think it's a good reminder that an important part of the story is sort of how people understood themselves in contestation, right? And a part of the reason why I included narratives from enslaved people who had worked with hemp was to talk about how they understood hemp and also how they understood their own skills, Like they talked about like how it was made and what roles they played in making it and how different ones of them played in making it. But it's a very important point. I appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you.
Did somebody give you a microphone?
I don't know if my question is much different from yours.
That's okay, go ahead.
So, what I was thinking about when you were talking, and great presentation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay. So, what I was thinking about when you were talking was Michelle Alexander's in the Jim Crow, right? In the beginning of the book, she talks about how the prison system was to supplant the previous system of slavery, right? And she talks about this history of how it is to supplant it. And so, as a political scientist, I'm thinking and this is kind of follow what Professor Gates was saying, when they're making the decisions to create the 13th Amendment, I wonder if there are any documents. Did you find any research that relates where they use, because you talk about Frederick Douglass and Henry Clay being in conversation as far as the abolishment of slavery and what to do, but also Clay supportive of the prison system. So I'm just thinking, is there any type of document or policies where you're seeing or anything where within Congress, when they're having these debates about amendments, in the 13th Amendment specifically, that there is some type of caveat to say, well, look at Kentucky as an example?
No, I spent a lot of time looking for the document that's like, look at Kentucky, but I haven't seen that. But it may be there. I haven't seen it yet in the archival research I've done. But I think there's two things you remind me of relevant to this question. One is, this history of incarceration and, say, slavery. Like, what exactly am I trying to say? And I guess while I do think we could add nuance to the conversation about the 13th Amendment, there is also another way that incarceration ties into slavery, in the sense that, like, someone who escaped from slavery could be jailed. If the owner didn't come before someone got there and paid the bail for the enslaved person, that person could take the slave as his or her property, right? There are ways in which, like, jails were used to detain and hold slaves, and that there's this kind of porous boundary between jails and slavery, even before penitentiaries, because, like, part of the story is about the story of the penitentiary, the story of a place that is either explicitly designed for reform or also a place where you wind up staying for a really long time. But jails, as a place you stay for a short time, have this really familiar relationship to slavery. So I do want to say that. In terms of the debates on the 13th Amendment, things like that, I think they have a lot to do with sort of whether different states or different people want slavery to spread further west. They're tied into this longer history of the question of the Northwest Ordinance and, like, which states will be slave-holding states, which states will not be, which ones will have power as a result of that. And so I guess this is a very important question, but I guess part of what I'm trying to emphasize is that this kind of subterranean discourse beneath that, just about how to continue making money, that doesn't really show up in these sort of congressional debates, in conversations.
So, I already have one. So yeah, my question was sort of like, how does this then change the way the United States operates under times of war? Because you kind of went right up to 1847, and I thought about, like, 1848, the Mexican-American War, and then, of course, Civil War. Like, do the border states, because you mentioned Missouri along with Kentucky, and then I'm thinking, like, okay, Maryland, and to some extent Delaware, which has this, of course, huge insurance sort of industry. Like, how do they then negotiate their kind of ways of preserving the infrastructure, not only of sort of slavery, but more of, like, the institution, that is a capital and materialist side, that preserves slavery, during wartime? Did that change during the Mexican-American War and the Civil War? How those border states, saw their positions, within, in the Civil War? How did that occur?
That's a great question, actually. And I mean, I hadn't necessarily thought about it quite this way, but the idea of wartime, what war presents is an interesting sort of lens, right? I do obviously mention kind of shift focus, and I don't necessarily want to say that convict leasing started right after the Revolutionary War, but I do want to say the Revolutionary War set in motion the developments that led to it, and it was partly this expanding West, building a new free society. What are the institutions essential to a free society? A prison is actually essential to enlighten free society, but then it becomes used for this more specific purpose of producing capital, extracting capital. But I think part of the story of war is also how does the country recover from war? Because it was partly this idea that most Americans have been plunged into debt, or the country was struggling in certain ways financially after the Revolutionary War, that made state legislatures lenient to debtors, that made the framers of the Constitution, or people who wanted commercial advantage or wanted the U.S. to be a country premised on commercial advantage, to sort of make things harder for debtors and easier for creditors, right? And so, and similarly, and Cornel West has written about this beautifully, like later wars, like World War II, African Americans not having access to GI Bill after World War II shaped kind of divergent paths for African Americans versus white Americans, right? So I think thinking about how the country recovers from war and who is enfranchised or disenfranchised in the aftermath of war is actually a very useful lens through which to make sense of what's happening,
Sir, do you have a question?
So it's kind of a weird question, but I was kind of So I was asking, like, what stops this, like, from happening again? Because police still arrest people for something as trivial, just like jumping over the turnstile. And like I was asking, like, what stops this from happening again?
Cool. Good question. Good question. Thank you. Yeah. So as Samai was saying, like in New York, for instance, like in the sort of research and activism around cash bail, one of the most common charges in New York for being arrested is like theft, what they call theft of services, or like jumping a turnstile, right? So you can be incarcerated and wind up staying incarcerated if you can't pay your bail from something as seemingly trivial as that. And I agree. And so I think part of what's at stake is how different offenses are classified, right? Like in some states, $300, stealing $300 is like a felony, right? So someone can steal a couple of video games and wind up being charged with a felony. So I think this question of like what act or is how the acts are classified. So this can stop it from, like this can cause it to change. If theft of services is merely sort of, you get a warning the first time, you know, and if it's never conceived of as like a really sort of harsh crime, deserving of a harsh penalty, that would change it. So I think the activism and the scholarship around these crimes and these punishments is what helps to change it, like we see with Rockefeller drug laws and the discourse on marijuana. So, good question.
All right, so thank you for this, Mike. I have a million questions, but I'm only going to ask one. And I kind of want to play devil's advocate right now, and because I know you like to do that a lot as well. So when you first started talking, and actually throughout the talk, I really thought you were going to push back pretty hard on this idea, this prevalent idea of the 13th Amendment. And in fact, I thought that's part of what Liz was kind of getting at, you know, going to this conference, I got to talk to these people, what am I telling them?
Right.
And I'm really thinking about one of the more subtle debates, I think, or actually, Liz, you may know if it's much bigger, debates in carceral studies, challenging this idea of there being a kind of direct link between the 13th Amendment and slavery. And instead parsing them out and thinking about, we should be thinking about the distinction between slavery, the institution of slavery, and mass incarceration. And so, you know, Patrick Rail has a really wonderful essay that came out, I think, 2 years ago. Dan Berger had a pretty explosive essay that came out 2 years ago, directly pushing back on this while also kind of applauding the scholarship that has come out about mass incarceration in the modern period. So I just want to read you just a quick quote and then hear your thoughts, because I think the narrative that you're telling actually does push back tremendously at this idea of there being a straight line from the 13th Amendment to present day. So the quote is, "Slavery and mass incarceration are not the same. All forms of racial oppression are not forms of slavery. Rather, slavery is one form of racial oppression, mass incarceration is another. While it may help to end it by associating with it an institution we abolished, it is not the remnant of a barbaric and outmoded system, but the product of modern society. The problem isn't the persistence of slavery. The problem is how a system that has always promised justice for all always seems to find a way to deny it to some."
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you
it's
could
a great
comment.
quote, and I appreciate your point, and I agree with you. I think so. If you look at like my two most recent projects and sort of book manuscripts, one is about life insurance, one's about incarceration or incarceration. The insurance one essentially is in some ways making an argument that in the last few decades of legalized slavery, there was almost like two tiers of slaves broadly construed. There are like plantation slaves who work in cotton. And interestingly, when you say you work on slavery and capitalism, people often say like, oh, where do you study cotton plantations? Where? You know, they assume this conflation of slavery and cotton is the only way to think about capital or capitalism. And so, but what you see is like slaves who were rented out after the slave trade is abolished, but slavery is still legal, are either artisans like blacksmiths, cobblers, nail makers, spinners, weavers, or slaves who work in really dangerous, really lucrative industries like coal miners, railroad workers, steamboat workers, or enslaved people who have particular sort of bureaucratic skills like clerks or something, or people who've been with households for decades and managed households like butlers, maids, things like that. And people who have these kinds of slaves, and you know, there are companies, railroad companies being built, 1820s, 30s, right? And they want they would prefer to hire an enslaved person who's worked on a railroad than an enslaved person who's been picking cotton. And if those slaves are rented to the railroad company, they're going to be insured because if they die while they're in the railroad company's possession, someone wants to recover the money for them. So there's these kind of tiers. So you have these, and these highly skilled slaves are sometimes much more mobile. Like some slaves who are coal miners work on site with free white workers, and there may be like 5 slaves at a coal mine, some white workers, and they may walk 100 yards to their site, and they have tags, they have to wear identification. If they go a different path, they could be lynched. It's not like they're free, but they're not under the lash literally all day like a cotton worker, because that's not even the ideal way to get access to their skill set, right? If they go into the mine, there are enslaved people who ran mines as foremen and things like that. So, but the reason why I say that is because when I think of slavery, I don't think of just a person picking cotton while there's an overseer with a whip on a horse. You know, for me, it depends what you're talking about. You're talking about enslaved people rented to a railroad, an enslaved butler working in a household, a slave in a cotton plantation. And I think part of the problem with the discourse on slavery and mass incarceration is like people think slavery is a particular thing and only one thing, like abject suffering and like kind of working on it. You know, they have a particular idea what slavery means, and they have a particular idea what incarceration means. But I think the more interesting question is, under what kind of slavery we're talking about, during which moment, and what is at stake? You know what I mean? And then similarly with incarceration, like, are we talking about someone who's jailed for a momentary period? Are we talking about someone who's in the penitentiary in the early years of the penitentiary when it's mostly about reform? Are we talking about someone who's in the penitentiary later when sentences are much longer? So I think I agree with this. Not only is slavery and mass incarceration not the same, but slavery, like what? Like a cook on a steamboat, you know, who's like Thomas Jefferson's, Sally Hemings' brother was Thomas Jefferson's chef, who's making gourmet French cuisine. You know, I don't want to sort of make it seem like we can't talk about slavery at all, but I do think it matters what we're talking about and when it's happening and what the person is doing, you know? Because part of the story of slave insurance is that, you know, the place where slaves were mostly rented from, like Virginia was the most urban state, the state with the most urban industries, and had the highest number of slaves who were rented out to companies, and the highest number of slaves were probably insured. And I don't think that's a coincidence that the DC metro area in Virginia is like one of the places where there's the most affluent sort of black demographics, right? I think there's something there about the skills people brought with them out of slavery and transmitted through generations, or the capital people accrued, like people who successfully navigated their way out of slavery, either buying themselves out of slavery or getting jobs for money right after slavery. Because, you know, Kentucky is like one sort of border area, but in Maryland, there are times when like an enslaved person might run away, who's like a maid in the household, and they might hire a recent arrival, like an immigrant, for very little money. And it was almost like an enslaved person who they negotiated with to give them time off to see their family members, or who thought so highly of and wanted to keep, who they even gave them sometimes cash or something like that, was not necessarily all that different from a recent immigrant who was exploited. You know what I'm saying? Like a highly regarded slave and a exploited immigrant had a kind of almost like complementary status. And I think that's why we have to have more nuance in some of these conversations, because what was slavery exactly when we're talking about slavery versus mass incarceration? So, yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And I tend to approach it more through specific context. You know what I mean? Like, not just, where I'm working. I'm not saying we can't make generalizations, but I do think it matters whether we're talking about like plantation slavery in the Cotton Belt or urban slavery in Virginia, or, you know, I think those distinctions matter. And it also matters what forms of incarceration we're talking about and at what moment. You know, like convict leasing in Kentucky in the 1830s is not the same as Rikers Island in 2018 either, right? And so like, I too would be wary of the kind of conflation, you know, even if we.
Are you saying there's been a big pushback since the popularity of the 13th against conflating slavery with incarceration?
I wouldn't call it a big pushback. I would say in maybe carceral studies, people can give a better overview of what are the debates within, but there's definitely a set of people, including, you know, people who appeared in the film, pushing back on the idea of, and I think Jelani outlined it in his film, you know, saying that there was this
Yeah, and I think also like. I agree. I also think that even for Joel Scott, like my story is more about how he took the way that slavery worked in Kentucky, and essentially had people who were incarcerated doing the same thing. But I don't mean to say that meant that it was the same thing. You know, I don't mean to say that like the hemp farm in the Kentucky Penitentiary worked exactly the same as like the hemp farm that like Henry Clay owned or something like that. I just want to say that he adapted the business model and institutionalized it in the prison, you know? And I guess like the people who seize opportunities to make money can often have an investment in, say, incarceration or various kinds of exploitation. And slavery is not the only one, obviously. But that doesn't mean that they're the same thing, yeah. I agree.
Hello, can you
Yeah.
hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I would like to follow up on this question because I had very much the same sort of inclination when I heard your talk. So the first thing I have is an observation.
Yeah.
One is, you know, if you look at the Latin American literature, especially in the sort of period some scholars call second slavery, right, there's a lot written about how various kinds of forced labor can exist side by side, right? So you can have, you know, you can have tributary labor, you can have slavery, you can have corvée labor, right? All these things can exist side by side. So maybe that would be something to also explore here in this Kentucky case. But building on Leah's point, one thing I think you should take very seriously, right, especially as you're looking at how people are coming up with sort of financial models of how this could be profitable, is, you know, slavery is a very unique form of forced labor in that your enslaved person cannot socially reproduce, right? Any offspring that an enslaved person has, right, will be owned by the owner, right? And so that creates a promise of regeneration of the labor force.
Not necessarily, though. Not necessarily. You know, because like in Maryland in like the last few decades of legalized slavery, there were people who kind of negotiated contracts like, okay, I'll be enslaved for X number more years, or people who, you know, I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, for instance, when you look at slave mortgages, right, this is something I've researched, you see scenarios where like, okay, a man had a mortgage on 3 slaves and used those mortgages to get land in like rural Louisiana, meaning that if he didn't pay his mortgage, they would seize his property and his slaves. But his slaves were a woman he had children with and his 2 children. And you think like, okay, these are 3 mortgage slaves and also a family or something like that. So I don't think and then sometimes when that man passes away, in his will, he leaves his land and his wealth to the woman. So it doesn't mean it's not coercive. Essentially, that family started in rape, because if the man purchased the woman that had children with her, that's a coercive situation, it's rape. But also, when he passes away and leaves his wealth and his land to them, those children will be biracial free people in America with land and wealth. So I don't think it's true that in slavery you can't reproduce.
Well, I mean, I think there are examples that are sort of fall outside the norm, but generally, right, if slavery is passed through the maternal line, right, and the mother is enslaved, generally most slave societies, right, that the children will be enslaved. Okay. So I think, you know, something to consider, right, is if you're transitioning into other kinds of forced labor, right, how do these people who are running these penitentiaries think about the regeneration of the labor force, right, a consideration they probably wouldn't have had quite the same way under slavery. Yeah. And also, you know, a slave is unique in the sense that they're very fungible, right? They're very mobile, right? You can sell an enslaved person anywhere, right? And that makes them have a sort of larger, capital value, right, than they would otherwise have. So,
but not necessarily either for that either, because I think, I mean, yes, but in the last few decades of legalized slavery in the U.S., since the slave trade is abolished, if people sell slaves, that's it. So that's why renting slaves and insuring slaves become so big, because you can't just sort of sell slaves and buy more, because it's illegal to do that now. So the way people generate capital is by renting them out, and that's why as they're rented out, this goes to Cornel West's point as well. Like it's the renting out of slaves and the process of those slaves acquiring skills, and the fact that those skills are marketable, that also gives those slaves mobility and opportunity to maneuver. So yes, but I guess I just want to contest. Like I think that it sounds like when you're formulating, you're saying under slavery it works like X, and I think that the historical circumstances of slavery, say before slavery, the slave trade was abolished and after, are different. And yes, I agree that like in the prison it worked differently, which is why they started extending sentences, right? But I just want to say that like not everything you're saying about how slavery works in general is true for slavery in different scenarios, because precisely for the point you made at the beginning, which is that like there's a big difference between an enslaved person who's been in the household for decades and is viewed as a highly valued member of the household, or an enslaved person who's had children with someone and is mortgaged, versus an enslaved person who's seen as a kind of plantation worker who could be worked to death in the field and then thrown into a mass grave. So I guess the reproduction of each of those enslaved persons is different.
So can I follow up with a question then?
Yeah.
Was it possible then to sell a convict in the same way that you would sell, like let's say
No.
you
I'm not disputing your broad classification. I'm just saying, and I think it's an important point that slavery and incarceration are different. You know, I think that's one point. I was just trying to say that the part when you're just talking about slavery, when you're saying the way that slavery worked, not everything you're saying about that does I subscribe to. You know what I mean? I need more specificity in how you're saying slavery worked. You know?
Yeah, so I guess I would point to sort of as they're moving towards away from this plantation model to this convict leasing model, right? How do these kinds of differences in the way that you can control an enslaved body versus the way you can control an incarcerated body, how does that create different sort of financial motives, different sort of financial, structures in terms of how this labor is being organized and perpetuated? That's sort of my overall
It's a good
question.
Yeah, I think part of it is that the plantation model, to some extent, started breaking down. Well, not breaking down, but the geography of the plantation model started to shift after 1808. So I think that whatever people are calling like the second slavery or domestic trade, I think that once slavery, like, it's expanding in some ways into like the deeper South, right, like Texas, Louisiana. So you have plantation systems there. And then I think also it's becoming more urban in places like Virginia or North Carolina. Actually, if I was to go back to the map that shows the beginning, Treasury where he sells, maybe I could just pull it up. In urban places, actually, slavery is not just a plantation model. It is actually, I wanted to talk about that. It's actually about also services and renting out and things like that. So I think to answer your question, you could point to like 3 distinct streams of revenue accumulation. I think that are important. Like one would be like the plantation slave who's a kind of laborer, almost treated like livestock. You know, it's like the more you pick, and there's a kind of calculus, but it's not that your expertise is highly valued, versus the category of slaves who are insured, where I would say they're highly skilled, more mobile, and their expertise is highly valued. And then also people are incarcerated for fixed periods of time, initially short periods of time and then longer periods of time. So I think it's actually really helpful what you're saying, that part of the strategy then becomes, well, if we're going to really exploit people in sort of carceral sites, precisely the logic of reform and reformation is undermining this. It's undermining it because it's fleeting. How can you build an industry with a fleeting mobile source of labor, to your point, So I think that the idea of what an incarcerated person is starts to change as sort of slavery is dying out, which doesn't mean it's the same as slavery, but I think that people are now looking for ways to establish a more enduring source of labor, right? A more enduring source of something like free labor. Yeah.
One of the big differences is that ultimately people are prisoners, they're no longer property. So part of what makes convict leasing so brutal is that planters and owners will people to death. So there was no, the point was not to reproduce them, the point was to work them as hard as they could, or as long as they could, and extract as much profit as possible.
Right. Or if they're skilled, if they're seen as highly skilled, there becomes some kind of negotiation. So I think part of the story is like actually the origins of the U.S. working class, I would argue, begin with the highly skilled slave, because there were slaves who were like minors, and their owners would like negotiate with them, even give them cash incentives, because they were so talented and they can make so much money. And so it was a different kind of model than like beating them to death. Oftentimes it was like, to get their best work, you gotta have to incentivize them, because they don't really have to mine as hard as they want to. And so I think the origins of the U.S. working class begin with a kind of highly skilled but dehumanized person or something like that, which is like, I think one thing we haven't quite talked about is the question of legal subjectivity. I think part of the reason why people sometimes make this conflation between slavery incarceration is because the idea of not having any rights in the eyes of the law or something like that. And I think the initial idea of incarceration was something more like you lost your rights temporarily, and by serving your sentence, you get them back. But then obviously we know about felon disenfranchisement is rampant, and that also makes it something like a permanent kind of status once you committed this crime, or a kind of status that you can't escape, which is more like, you know. But I just pulled the map to show you that, like, some of the sites where you have the highest numbers of enslaved people wind up being like North Carolina, Virginia, some in Maryland, and then in some southern states around sort of like highly urbanized centers, you have also a lot of states are insured, and then it sort of depends about industry. There's a lot of miners, there's a lot of people working in hemp, other kinds of agriculturalists, carpentry, steamboats, things like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think Mary's making a really important point. You know, I guess, I don't know if I'm giving you a satisfactory answer, but I think it's an important point about the difference in terms of labor management or something, or like an organizational culture, right?
Futurity, right? Planning
Yeah.
Planning for the continuation of your sort of
Yeah.
But also you have to remember that there are only 388,000 Africans who shipped to the United States directly from Africa, right? And another 50,000. So let's another 70,000. So 450,000 out of 10.8 million Africans came to the New World. And the slave trade is abolished January 1st, 1808 into the United States. By 1860, there are 4.4 million African Americans in the United States, 3.9 million are slaves. So we have to be careful when we say they were just working people to death, because they weren't.
Yeah.
You know, they were quote unquote growing slaves.
Yeah.
It's a big investment. You know, you're going to go out and shoot your car.
Right.
You know, people don't do that. That's
Right.
not a rational thing to do in an economic system. There's no justification of slavery. Then when you do comparisons with Cuba got 1 million, Jamaica got 1 million, Brazil got 5 million.
Right.
That's what they were working to do.
Right,
And they're replacing.
right.
And they didn't care about that.
And in the U.S. states where slaves were construed as abundant and where their labor is construed as unskilled, you see the same kind of dynamics. So I think it is more particular. Like in the plantation South, where you do have cotton plantations, where there are some notions that there are a lot of black people and you can just kill, work them to death. But I think you're right that that's not merely what it was. And I think that's good.
It's not merely or especially what
Yeah,
it was.
yeah.
It's an economic system designed to continue to make you profit.
Right.
That was the bottom line. That's what capitalism is.
Right.
You've been very patient.
Oh, it's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Look forward to your book. I'm going to stay in my music and culture lane, if that's okay. But I can't help but just hear my old Kentucky home in my head, because that's what I, think through minstrelsy and blackface a lot. So my old Kentucky home was adopted as Kentucky state song in like 1928. But it was written in 1852 by Stephen Foster, the father of American song, who made his whole entire lot off of blackface minstrelsy. But it was based on his reaction to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. So the song was imagined as sort of being this nostalgic reference back to a certain Kentucky beautiful land and home that the conditions were better there for the enslaved, and they were being taken away to be leased, basically, because the space that the person was inhabiting, the owner didn't have the money, so they were being paid off as debt. So basically what you're talking about here, right? So I'm just wondering how, and then the way that you talk through Henry Clay in relation to Lincoln and how we might reimagine that, how thinking through the sort of conditions of why slavery was seen in a particular way there. But what I'm curious what was in the space of Kentucky, especially being, as you mentioned, sort of another establishment of Virginia in a way, and sort of pushing then also their progressive reforms. What is it about the sort of imaginary and the sort of cultural landscape of this space that also allowed for these types of things to make it both into the political, cultural, and sort of imaginary realm, I believe? I don't know if that's a question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and I think all these questions are really helpful, I think, and very insightful. I'm inclined to sort of go back to Cornel West's point again with this question of free people of color in Kentucky after slavery, because there were a lot of kind of fraternities and sororities, or sort of like charities started by African Americans designed to help each other and things like that. So you can see a lot of the ways that people kind of carved out kind of mutual aid practices in Kentucky. And then I also think that part of what Kentucky wrestles with is this idea that, okay, so it was not in the Confederacy, and yet slavery was legal, but then slavery was reduced to maybe a select number of slaves on different household farms. So slavery was legal, but it's not pervasive. It doesn't seem like it's tremendous, but it's significant, you know? And then the places where slavery was, then still became the places where black people lived, right? So Kentucky ends up being racially stratified and has particular geography around race that sometimes is masked because it doesn't have the numbers, or it's not perceived as coercive as the South or something like that. And I think these various dynamics are important for understanding the kind of place Kentucky is, you know? And it is also, I think, important for this kind of argument I'm making about it being a kind of frontier, you know, like an experiment in capitalism, sort of drawing on what's been learned from the plantation South, but kind of like innovating or something like that.
And you have a whole thing with the bluegrass as bluegrass here too.
Right,
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, that's right.
Great, thanks. Great discussion.
Thank you.